Welcome to On the Level, broadcasting from the Blue Ocean Network studios here in Beijing. My name is Fergus Thompson. Now, there was a time when a university education essentially meant a classical education, the study of classical languages, literature, history and culture. But times have changed. Science and more practical areas such as economics and business are now the kings of academia. Even humanities departments are expected to pay their way, and this has made it difficult for classical departments, which everywhere tend to be losing numbers of students, losing funding. Everywhere, well, not quite, because here in China, classical studies are doing quite nicely, thank you. Students are in some cases even travelling to Italy to further their studies. Well, to discuss this movement east of the classics, I'm joined in the studio today by somebody intimately involved in the blossoming of this field of studies here in China. Quentin Dauthier is a lecturer in classical European languages and literature at the Graduate School of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He also teaches a Latin option at a prestigious Beijing high school. And in addition to this, he is an advisor to Latinitas Sinica. That's a national level research centre for Latin language and culture at Beijing Foreign Studies University. Quentin Dauthier, welcome to On the Level.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we go into the area of classical studies here in China, you are from Louisiana. I would have thought that was fertile ground for a Latinist to come through, despite the South's wonderful cultures and traditions. How did it produce a Latinist?
Well, Louisiana is the dead center of the Old South, and it's a very traditional type of culture. It was a very Roman Catholic state for a long time, so Latin was just part of daily life. I mean, masses were done in Latin, and people thought it strange when they weren't. So Latin training was always just there. And for me, I was always inclined toward older things, antiquities. And so for me, began it really as something I liked doing as a hobby, and then turned into something more formal.
And following this, now you have qualifications, you're a degree in classical studies in the United States, but you end up teaching Latin in China, of all things. How did that come about?
Well, in the States, I volunteered at an adult school, teaching, as it turned out, English as a second language, because that was what they wanted. And that's how I got to do what I really liked to do in my spare time. And then as time went on, I had opportunities to come to China for doing similar work. I had a friend already here, and he asked me to come over. That was in 1998. And I came, and I liked very much what I saw. And so my first work here was really teaching English composition, which I still do, actually, English composition and literature. And as time went on, making connections and people getting to know me, it turned into teaching Latin and Greek as well.
Right. Classics, this word we use to describe Latin and Greek studies from the Latin classicus, meaning the higher level of citizenry. Would you consider your students to be the higher level of citizenry in China?
As it turns out, yes, because I teach in highly selective institutions. So the students who manage to get in there, they're, at least intellectually speaking and academically speaking, elite. Because otherwise they wouldn't be there.
Well, you would say about that about them anyway, wouldn't you? They are your students.
They're my students, that's right. It reflects badly if they're not.
But the age-old question, which is asked in every school, particularly in the Western world, in Europe and probably in the United States at one stage, why do we have to study Latin? What good is it? It's a dead language. Do you get this sort of question from your students here? Why do students in China study Latin?
I think the key is they don't have to. Kids don't like being told what to do. They don't like being forced. And so generation after generation of students in Europe and America were forced-fed Latin. There was no choice. But here, they're optional. In the high school level, where I teach an introductory Latin course up to the intermediate level, it's an elective course. So when I introduce the course, I explain very clearly it's a tough language, it requires a lot of dedication, and essentially I try to discourage as many students as I can from signing up.
Well, that's sort of handy then. So there's sort of an element of self-selection. The students who are not going to like it weed themselves out.
Oh, that's right. They just don't choose the course if they don't want something that's really tough. And so the students who take Latin are generally students who are already pretty good at foreign language. They're good at English. They're interested in it. And a lot of them take the course, I think, initially because Latin builds English vocabulary. Quite a lot. It helps to develop an understanding, like on an etymological level, of how English words are built. I mean, let's say, I believe it's somewhere around close to 70% of our English vocabulary derives either directly from Latin or from Anglo-French, which is a descendant of Latin.
Right. And, well, that's just what I was going to ask you. What is in it for these students? And you said, for example, improvement of their English, perhaps getting higher marks in SATs, if that's right, where they're going afterwards. Is this something that would help them stand out from other students?
It does. That's one of the difficulties for Chinese students going abroad, is that it's hard for them to stand out. They generally go through the same sort of educational courses, they have the same training, same background. They're all really usually very good at testing, so they look very good on, let's say, SAT or TOEFL or whatever else they're taking. And then what makes you really stand out? What have you done? You know, what kind of extracurricular work? And so a foreign language of that sort is an easy way.
Something exotic.
It's exotic, and it makes you kind of stand out in the application process.
Right. But it must be a hard sell for these students, maybe to their parents who might be looking to produce, you know, not in China a doctor, perhaps an economist or a business person, and parents here very much want their children to succeed. Do you think that's the case?
I haven't had that problem with my students' parents. Actually, maybe just in several cases, I think the students have actually, their parents enjoy the fact that they're taking Latin, because it's kind of a, I don't know, maybe it's a face thing. You know, the students are doing something very exotic. It's known to be a very complex language, very important to our Western culture, and having a child who could read Latin very well is a nice thing to mention at cocktail parties.
A bragging point, and, and bragging points are very much in the social system in China.
Sure.
Looking at the relationships between say these two empires, the Roman Empire at its zenith around the 1st century AD, and at that time the Han Empire in China was rising, or had risen up. So you had these two empires on sort of at that stage opposite sides of the world. Was there any contact between them at that stage?
As far as I'm aware, no direct contact, but of course there were exchange in goods along, you know, there were sort of a buffer kingdoms between China and the Roman Empire, and there was trade across. I mean, you find Roman glass in Han Dynasty tombs. You find Roman silk, Chinese silk in Rome. I mean, even Cato the Elder complained about it. Too expensive and causing the treasury of Rome to being shipped out to some parts unknown, and all sorts of things, and immodesty. Chinese ladies wore layer and layer and layer of silk, but it was so expensive that the Roman women would just put 1 or 2 layers on, and it was transparent, and well, that didn't sit well with the old...
So indirectly, Chinese silk was the downfall of Rome and led to its moral decadence.
That's maybe not, but it didn't help, I guess.
Looking at slightly ahead in history a bit, further on in contacts, and these are verifiable contacts between China and the West as we know it, or Europe. The religious orders, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, were very much involved in coming to China basically to convert people here.
Yes,
but
that's right.
They were operating largely through Latin, weren't they, at the time?
Oh, that's right.
What sort of a legacy did that have?
Well, you know, people like, let's say, Matteo Ricci, or in the Chinese call him Li Mado, he contributed a great deal to the Ming Dynasty culture, let's say Chinese culture, but in the Ming Dynasty he was there bringing a lot of technology, Western technology with him. He was a highly skilled individual. I mean, he was really like a true Renaissance man. I mean, the emperor would ask for a map of the world, and he could draw one. He could repair clocks, and he could make glass, and he was just an all-around very brilliant guy. And he's buried here in Beijing, actually the first foreigner to be allowed burial here, official burial, by imperial decree. So the Jesuits and the other orders, they had a great influence in terms of, they really caught the interest of the literati in China at the time.
Linguistically, of course, if they were writing about China and sending information back to their headquarters in Spain or Italy or wherever it happened to be, this presumably would be in Latin.
Sure.
So there must be a lot of information about China in Latin.
There's a whole section of the Vatican Library that's dedicated to these texts that were sent back, and there are a lot of texts here that are still collected in Latin that await translation. And so Latin, and it's not such an unusual thing. I mean, there were books written for Chinese students to learn Latin in the early 19th century. And you have Chinese grammar books that go back to the early 18th century, written in Latin. In fact, I was just in a class the other day, we were talking about Champollion, the translator of the Rosetta Stone, the decipherer of the Rosetta Stone. And when he was a teenager, he got sick, and he asked his brother, something to make him feel better. He asked for a Chinese grammar book, and he taught himself Chinese grammar. I don't know what extent he taught himself Chinese, but on those particular grammar books, they referred to Chinese characters as hieroglyphs. And no doubt this must have linked over to some of his theoretical thinkings of the Egyptian hieroglyphs and may have helped out.
For the modern Chinese student of Latin, then, this must be fascinating, having an outside view of their country in the past through this language that they're learning.
Yes, actually, at a conference I was at some years ago, I don't remember who said it, but it was a professor, a Chinese professor of history from Beijing, or maybe Guangdong, and he said, by studying the Western classical languages, then in Chinese history we have two legs to stand on, meaning we have the access to Chinese sources, and now we have access to Western sources as well. But up until, let's say, the last 15 years or so, there were very, very few people, Chinese people, who could manage reading Latin or Greek, and now there are more and more.
Now, the orders that were here for one main reason. They were looking for souls, and they were converting people here. The other things were sort of ancillary. But presumably those converts, and I think, as far as I know, they were aiming at sort of higher levels of society when they were looking for conversions. Were these people presumably then were also speaking Latin? Are there any remnants of that particular history that have led up to the present day?
One of my friends, a colleague, Leopold Leib at Renda, he spends a lot of time studying the Latin influence on Chinese vocabulary. And a lot of technical terms came into Chinese through this period.
So there are words in modern Chinese today that people would presume are Chinese, but actually have a Latin
Well,
origin.
I wouldn't say they presume are Chinese. I mean, words like logic. The word logic is 逻辑, in Chinese, and that's just a sound-alike for this, and it's logicus, logicus in Latin. So this is where it comes in, or the use of the word spirit, the spirit of this and the spirit of that. This comes in through Latin phraseology and things like that.
Do other governments, Italian government, the Greek government, do they benefit from this interest in classics here in China? On the other hand, do they actually promote it?
I don't know to what how many students a year go to Italy or to Greece or something like that, but I do know that there are more students recently going to do studies in Latin or other studies in Italy. I mean, there are a lot of students who go there to study, and that certainly would help their economy. I mean, it's not free, so they're paying, and that's a good thing, I suppose, for Italy. And Chinese get good educations in return. But
we hear so much about soft power from the Chinese side these days. This seems a relatively inexpensive way of sort of, boasting about your country if you're Greek or Italian, and say, well, these are our ancient languages, this is our culture, history, philosophy. You're studying this at prestigious universities here in China.
True enough. I'm not so sure to what extent they promote these things. I mean, the Italian embassy offers some Latin training, and we at Latinita Sinica this summer we're taking 13 or 14, I think 13 university students to Rome to study Latin there. But in that case, the prices are kept artificially low to make it easier for the students to afford it. So it's not a big money maker in that case for Italy, but it's a very good cultural opportunity for the Chinese students, some of whom have spent years studying Western literature and culture and have never actually seen it in the flesh, and now they get a chance to do it and also have an intensive Latin study as well.
Well, speaking about people who have invested time in studying another language and culture like this, we're all pretty comfortable with the idea of sinologists in the West, in the United States and in Europe, spending decades studying China and Chinese, but never actually coming to the country, possibly for political reasons during more recent times. But this is the other side of the coin. Now we've got Chinese scholars studying another ancient culture from this side. Does that bring anything to the table that they're coming from a fresh perspective?
They do bring their Chinese-ness, which is still highly exotic in the West, and their own view of our literature, which is something that is still very exotic. I mean, we look at ourselves in the mirror and we have our own opinions, but when you have someone else looking at you from a very different cultural background, they very often have very important things to say to you about who you are. because that's an angle that you've never looked at. I mean, it's some weird off-center and to the left that you never thought to look at. And having Chinese sensibilities added to that, it could be quite beneficial, more to the European perspective than to the Chinese themselves. I mean, from the point of view of literature.
Right.
Because how many people in the West really understand anything about China at all? Even university professors may have taught years in things like sociology or psychology or literature and never once broached the subject. And now here's a Chinese PhD candidate, highly versed in their ancient culture and their ancient poetry and their ancient literature, and then looking at you know, The Great Gatsby or something, and then making a comment about it.
In terms of departments in universities in the West, as I mentioned in the introduction, they're finding fewer numbers of students, and presumably as professors and lecturers age, fewer teachers. Is this a source of fresh blood into the discipline?
Yes.
Would you hope to be training the future professors of Oxford and Cambridge here in Beijing?
Well, that would be very strange. I suppose, it could happen, I guess. I say to my colleagues, and I say this very honestly, I mean, when I started teaching Latin, my goal was to make myself obsolete, because there's no reason for a foreign person to teach this language. There are no native speakers. I mean, there's a very good argument that you need a native English speaker to teach English, but there are no native speakers of Latin or classical Greek. And so a Chinese student has every opportunity to reach the highest levels of proficiency and the highest levels of academic achievement in these fields. There's no reason in the world why the most eminent scholar of Latin in the next 20, 30 years shouldn't be a Chinese person. There's no reason for that. And we're still, in a large sense, trying to get the Chinese out of the habit of looking at us as great authorities. I mean, right now we have only one thing in our favor, and that is a lot of experience. I mean, I've been studying these languages for 30 years. It'll take a while for someone to outdo me, but it will inevitably happen. I mean, I know students now who are young PhDs who have really good Latin. I mean, really good Latin, sight reading Ovid and able to analyze. Give that another 5 or 10 years, and well, that's where it is.
In the West, whether it's the United States or Europe, any country, we've grown up in a sort of a cultural seed that has its basis in Latin and Greek philosophy and history. So it's all around us, as you mentioned, in the English language, 70% and so on. Are there challenges for somebody coming from a Chinese background without this cultural knowledge to get the same, to be able to study the language and the culture and the philosophy to the same level? Is it more difficult?
Yes. I've met students in my own work who will have done very, very well in terms of learning the, let's say, we call it the morphology of the language, the structure of the nouns and the adjectives and the verbs and the conjugations, the declensions and all these things. And they can translate very easily from Latin into whatever language they like. But suddenly when it mentions Theseus and Ariadne, well, they don't know that story. And they don't know about the Minotaur or something. And so they spend a little time reading mythology to catch up. But a lot of the allusions and things like that are just not there. That even guys walking on the street, let's say in a Western country, they don't know Theseus anymore. And I found that Chinese students have an interest in studying these things, the mythology. And so that's the one thing that they would lack. Or maybe coming from, let's say, a Christian background, Christian society. I mean, not practicing Christian, but the Christian background. There are certain things that would get lost in translating, let's say, medieval Latin or something like that, where you don't have a cultural context to understand what's going on. That requires additional training. Whereas we would only need the Latin. They would need this other component as well.
But no more of a challenge, I suppose, than somebody from a Western background studying ancient Chinese or history, because again, you haven't grown up with those sayings and those adages.
Exactly. I mean, if you don't know Hong Lu Meng, you know, I mean, this is referred to constantly in Chinese text. So even at my house, I have a dictionary of words and phrases, you know, that's specifically from this one piece of literature. But if you don't have that background, it's the same story. Right. You have to spend some time learning it. But that's the one thing that's a little tough.
Not just a language and a culture, but also classical philosophy. Do you find it here in China, is there interest in the very different philosophical approach that came from the Greeks and the Romans, and which obviously didn't affect China at that time? Are politicians, for example, who in China are well known for studying history and trying to find comparisons, would they be interested in that area?
I heard, I don't know that it's exactly true, but I heard that it's true that the former premier read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations once a year or twice a year. And that's a Stoic philosopher. But people I interact with, they're very well versed in our classical philosophy, even if that's not their major field. They've read something of Plato's Dialogues, or they've read a bit of Aristotle, or they at least know who those people are. Mm-hmm. Even in high school, people will know who Socrates is and how he plays in the general theme of Western philosophy.
Right. The methodology. Now, in school, I was taught to sort of learn off declensions and conjugations, and if I was lucky, after a few weeks, I'd try to scrabble together "the boy loves the girl" or something like this and get it wrong. You use a different methodology here, not that traditional style. Explain a little bit about how you teach Latin.
I use a different methodology, but most Latin classes in Beijing use that traditional methodology, okay. Grammar translation, which you know, it's to me it's a little dull, but it does work. You do learn it in the end. For me, at least, I prefer the natural approach. So we start our course reading a Latin text, which is very, very, very simple, which was created by a Danish scholar. I think he began working on it more than 50 years ago, and then he died just as he was really putting the final touches on the whole thing. And so it starts with just very basic sentences in Latin that students, even Chinese students with no background really, can kind of figure out if they have some pretty good English. The first sentence is Roma in Italia est. Then I just have to say that est is, right. And then they figure Rome is in Italy. And then from there, the course moves at a very steady progression through 40 chapters. And in the 41st chapter, you're reading Livy, Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city.
But are you using Latin in the classroom as a French teacher would use French in the classroom?
Yes, I will use teaching instructions in Latin, and I will ask review questions in Latin and have them answer in Latin as well.
So it becomes almost a living language then for them?
Well, for some people, Latin is still a living language. I mean, I know scholars in Italy, for example, Luigi Moravia. Latin is as reflexive to him as his Italian. And his students learn to speak both Latin and ancient Greek fluently and reflexively. And it's just about environment. Everyone gets, when you learn Latin or Greek from the grammar translation method, it becomes almost so complex your mind can't get around it. But if you approach it from a natural point of view, I mean, every beggar in Athens spoke Greek. Every bum in Rome spoke Latin. So it's nothing. I mean, anyone who could learn something like Finnish could definitely learn to speak Latin. You know?
I mentioned that you are an advisor to this organization, Latinitas Sinica, which is under the Beijing Foreign Studies University Research Center into Latin and Language and Culture. What's that all about?
It was established a couple of years ago to promote Latin education in China, and it's headed by my friend Dr. Michele Ferrero, who teaches Latin and also Greek at Beijing Foreign Studies University. We put together conferences. Just last year, we had an international conference about the 1700th anniversary of the Edict of Milan. And we had some scholars come to talk about what they knew, but also to introduce it to Chinese students who not only didn't know the Edict of Milan, but didn't know Constantine.
So the idea is to research, but also to promote classics, Latin in this case.
That's right. Get people to know what's there. That there is such a thing as Latin, and this is why we would study it. And we offer a free Latin course to anyone who can sign up quickly enough. And every year we have between 150 and 200 students who come from, not just in Beijing, from outside Beijing. They travel to get to these Latin courses. It's intensive. It goes on over about a 10 to 12-day period. At the end, they get a certificate from BY, and we have an advanced course for students who've gone through once. They can come through and do more advanced study, and it works very, very well. We bring teachers internationally into Beijing, mostly from Rome, one from America, me, local, and Michele is also local, and we get together and we teach these students Latin very quickly.
Is the core of classical teachers here in Beijing a sort of a small village, everybody knows each other?
When we have dinner together, we say, you know, if a bomb went off.
So you all fit in, you all fit in one dining room?
We fit on one table. And we always say if a bomb goes off, it's done. You know, we can all be wiped out. It's the end of classics in China. Right. But there are other activities. I mean, there's someone in Shanghai teaching. I don't know the details there, but I know there's something going on there. Thierry Maynard is teaching here in Beijing at University of International Business Economics. They run a center there called the Beijing Center. And he also is teaching at Zhongshan University in Guangdong. And Professor Nicholas Kass, who is a visiting professor from Furen University, teaches comparative literature and Latin at Beijing University, and he also goes back to Taipei to teach Latin there once a month. So we're sort of moving around here and there, filling in the gaps. This is
your professional career, but you said Latin was always a hobby of yours, and you have a website through which people can learn Latin online.
Yes.
So do you get many Chinese students signing up to that? Do you know who's signing up?
Not so much. Actually, that website is sort of a project of mine that I've been working on in my spare time. And so right now, I've got lessons that could last up to 2 years' worth of study. But the website is actually blocked from search engines. I've blocked it because I don't want a rush, because it's not really complete. So my students, occasionally anyone who gets my business card has the website. You can go directly to it. My intention was to get it all working really, really nicely and then open it so that people could come in. But I've noticed, I guess maybe 30, 40 students over the last couple of months, somehow, through passing my card around or something, have signed up, and they're working through the lessons.
Another long-term project, well, the classics in China. Is this a fad, a flash in the pan, or do you see the study of this field steadily growing in the future?
I see it growing because we have students now who are getting PhDs in the subject, going to Italy and coming back, fully trained classicists. And the question is, do they have passion for teaching the language, or are they just getting their degrees for research purposes? In my opinion, and this is not a very academic thing to say, is less research, more teaching. You have to get it out there. I mean, I've always been a classroom teacher. I love teaching. That's what I really enjoy doing. But you have to get someone who is really interested in it. One of my friends, a very eminent Latinist, actually, Reginald Foster, he said that Latin classes were like music classes. Some students go to a music class, they come out hating Mozart. If that's the case, then there's something wrong with the class. There's nothing wrong with Mozart. Latin is the same. If you want people to really enjoy it, you've got to teach it well, and you've got to believe in it, and you've got to love it yourself. So for me, when I prepare my lessons and things like that, I'm always trying to interest myself. The students are really quite secondary in my plan. And the reason is because I think if they can see that I love this thing and I'm enjoying it, then at least there's something enjoyable there. It's not all conjugations and declensions and all this other nightmarish stuff. There's something really great there. And so I hope through that I've interested people. One of my students actually has a PhD in English literature, but when he started teaching at his university now, he's teaching an introductory class in Latin. And so that's my first student teaching from my efforts anyway.
Well, the first of many. I'm sure with that sort of passion, classical studies have, in your hands, certainly a bright future in China. Quentin Dauthier, thanks very much for coming on The Level.
Thank you for having me.